welcome. And I want to start out, just let me know a little bit. Give us just a little idea of how you came to Indianapolis, the whole transition.
Sure, yeah. So I moved to Indianapolis end of the summer of 2016. And this was sort of after a kind of a lengthy process of an audition. There was an audition for this principal trumpet job here in, I think, June of 2015, actually. And then there was multiple trial weeks spaced out over the course of that following season. So actually, I was playing in the Tucson Symphony at the time of the audition. And then I think the trial weeks were spaced out maybe November and then January or something to that effect. And then so during that year, I actually got a one-year position with the San Francisco Ballet Orchestra. So I sort of moved to San Francisco that year and then kind of flew to Indianapolis to do these trial weeks, and then ended up finding out that I got the gig, which was awesome. And so I sort of finished up the season of the ballet and opera in San Francisco. I guess that would have been summer of 2016, and then moved to Indy. So I've been here since. Yeah.
So the San Francisco position, was that also by audition?
They had a sort of an audition for a one-year position for that gig, and so it kind of just worked out that I was able to do that, and then sort of transition into here to start in, I guess, the fall of 2016. So
a lot of those one-year positions have the possibility of extending.
Yeah.
In San Francisco, had there been a possibility of
I
doing
think
that? Would you have jumped on that?
I think that one may have been. I think with that gig, I would have had to re-audition at some point. I believe. I was kind of at the mindset of the time anyway that I wasn't really necessarily looking at it as like a long-term thing, only just because I was in the running for this job here, and I sort of was trying to focus on that, So it was sort of the San Francisco thing sort of just popped up, and I just went for it. But really, with my eye turned to just focusing on hopefully locking this one down. So and I've been here for now two seasons, just finished up, so it's been kind of flying by.
Granted tenure finally.
Hopefully, it's kicking in, I believe, in September. So
yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
So, of course, we've played together a couple of times, and it's just been a thrill to be able to do that. One of the things that I really appreciate is not just your musicianship, but you really are doing a great job of bringing cohesion to not just the brass section, but it seems like the orchestra all together. And it's a really cool vibe. When you walk on stage. Now, Indianapolis, I think, is unusual too, because it's not, from my perception, an orchestra that is kind of at each other. It's always been a great feel.
Super great vibe
to walk into that group.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I first picked up on. I mean, I first came to Indianapolis. I guess it was 2015, but like ever since I first met anybody here, played here, anything like that, it was like this super warm vibe, and I was like, whoa, seems a little unusual in a way. And so it's been really easy, I think, to plug into that type of energy and sort of just kind of build upon that, within the trumpet section for sure, but even, as you said, the whole brass section, but sort of the orchestra as a whole, it's been easy to just kind of pop into that type of feel and roll with that, in a way.
So you're still young. You might not be at the pinnacle of your career just yet, but you've obviously done some things extremely well to get you to this point. And of course, that's your own personal drive, but also has to include some really influential teachers along the way, some fantastic opportunities, some educational and playing opportunities. And I'd like to know who you studied with, methods that they've used, ways that those things have been adapted to you, or ways you've adapted those things to your playing. And I know that's a pretty broad question, but can you speak to it?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to, I guess, kind of go through the history of it as sort of succinctly as I can. But I first started out studying trumpet on Long Island in New York, where I grew up about an hour or so from the city. And my first trumpet teacher was actually a buddy of Phil Smith's. They played in the Salvation Army band together and stuff like that. And so he was very much of the sort of B-flat trumpet, Arbans type, slightly cornetti style tradition. And so when I first started as a kid, he was kind of my first main trumpet teacher. And so I studied mostly Arbans and things like that with him. And then I guess I'll just speak to the classical side of things for now. But, my first trumpet teacher outside of this guy, Doug Mendoza, on Long Island, was Kevin Cobb, who plays in the American Brass Quintet.
Terrific.
And so my junior year of high school, I started going into Juilliard Pre-College to study with Kevin. And that, right around that time, was the first time I've ever really had been around just a lot of super high quality trumpet sounds up close, especially. I had taken a lesson actually with Ray Riccomini of the Metropolitan Opera in preparation for this audition at pre-college, and that was sort of the first like full-time orchestral player I ever heard play a tone just like up close. And I actually remember pretty much nothing about this lesson except for we were in his living room up in the Bronx, and I was going to work on the Hindemith or something. I just hacked through this on my whatever. And Ray's like, oh, yeah, let me just take a look at this real quick. And I just remember him kind of just like blowing through a couple things, kind of warming himself up. And like this, something about hearing this sound quality up close, it like knocked me sideways. And, you know, that whole juncture kind of around that time, and then starting to study with Kevin was my first real exposure to the orchestral side of things. And with Kevin, very similar thing. A lot of Arbans. We do a lot of Brandt. Very sort of simple nuts and bolts type stuff. And that transitioned well into, I think, my college sort of years. I studied at the Cleveland Institute of Music. And my main teacher there was Mike Miller, who was fourth trumpet in the orchestra. Also studied with Bob Sullivan a little bit and Mike Sachs. And that whole tradition in Cleveland is very sort of similar to how I grew up. A lot of B-flat trumpet, a lot of Arbans, a lot of real emphasis on just like deep fundamentals of just, you know, basic tone production, rhythm, fanfare style playing, articulation, those kind of things, you know. So, you know, lips, flexibility, all the classic stuff, but it was a very like, you know, nuts and bolts, Rust Belt type of focus there.
To that point, though, I mean, you had to have your stuff pretty well together at this point. Or were there specific things that you were addressing with these?
Yeah,
features?
I mean, I guess to a certain degree, things were like working okay. I guess for a 18-year-old,
I mean, to expose, you know, some flaws in your
no. I mean, I got plenty of flaws that I could expose all day. Yeah, no. But I was like functional, but I was definitely. I mean, as far as like a put together trumpet player, I feel like I was nowhere that during my undergrad, really at any time, except for maybe towards the end of my senior year. But, you know, I went through a ton of transformations. Mostly my sound was like the biggest thing that I worked on and tried to develop during this time. But, I mean, it was like, you know, maybe I could articulate okay. My sound was like okay. All this stuff was sort of just like mezzo somewhere. And I think that being around this type of sound quality, all those guys in the Cleveland Orchestra and that type of tradition, it really just becomes very apparent to you very quickly how much work you have to do. So I was a very, I mean, probably much to my own detriment in a lot of ways, but I really, you know, I tried to really work hard in college and spend a lot of time in the practice room working on all these really basic kind of things. And, you know, it was sort of around the end of my time there, and then when I went to school out in Los Angeles after my undergrad, I studied with Jim Wilt for 2 years at the Colburn School, which is a very small orchestral kind of type conservatory thing. You know, Jim is very much not that kind of a teacher like I had in high school or college. I mean, he wouldn't assign you stuff, wouldn't want to really necessarily work on fundamentals or things like this. It's not like he wouldn't value that stuff, but he was more of like a, you know, you'd bring something in, play it for him, and then he'd sort of teach you how to like listen differently to hear the kind of issues that need to be addressed. But it was all still very much kind of up to your own sort of work ethic if you wanted to really delve into those things pretty hard. But I would still, I mean, I had Jim go through certain types of Brandt things with me or Arbans, and I would kind of coax him into playing back and forth with me a lot because I would, you know, record these lessons and go home, and then for weeks and even years after I graduated, listen to this kind of a thing.
So that's going towards one of the things I want to query about, and it's that the different learning styles that people have. You know, there are people who are visual, there are people who are aural, and everything I've heard right now is like you wait or you want that listening experience. You hear that sound, and that's what you're trying to emulate. Yeah, and that's. Am I right? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about what my style of learning was, but now that I'm like blabbering on about it, but hearing you just kind of dial it in, I definitely think that the way I've always operated is very much from an ear side of things. So it was really helpful. It was almost like, you know, I worked on all this building the cement bricks type of vibe in Cleveland, and then I rolled into LA, started working with Jim, and like it was almost like the back and forth thing is I think where I learned the most from him, you know. And I definitely can learn from people saying certain things at the right time or in the visual imagery perhaps here and there, but definitely for me listening is the best way I think for me to learn.
So let's travel back however many years it is to where you're picking up the trumpet for the first time or deciding that trumpet's going to be the instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Had you heard fantastic trumpet players to that point or poor trumpet players to that point?
Yeah, I definitely had. I kind of had a weird journey to get to the trumpet, but I actually started as a cello player. Well, I wasn't really a cello player, but I started on Suzuki cello at age 4, you know, dabbled in that until I switched to trumpet at 9. Mm-hmm. And I kind of just sort of stumbled into picking the trumpet. My grandfather played trumpet, and I think I sort of just figured that, I don't know. I'm not even too clear on how that happened per se.
But I can see where, because Suzuki is such an aural process.
Yeah.
I can see where that could have played a really big role in your learning style further on.
Totally,
because how many books or years is it before the Suzuki student gets to opening the book?
Yeah, I don't think, I could barely, I don't even think I could read in 6/8 even by the time I was 15. It's like reading music was, I eventually realized like, oh God, I got to figure this out. And so, and I started really focusing on that kind of thing, and now I can sort of read just fine. But like, it was rough though. Suzuki, you don't learn how to read music, and you kind of just learn by ear. And so I always was very much like, if somebody played something, I could basically, it'd be easier for me to just like play it back to them by ear without looking at anything than if I had to like read it and then play it back to them type of thing. Especially when I was young, I like fudged through so many trumpet lessons by like, oh shoot, wait, Mr. Mentorship, can you play that actually real quick just to hear? And then I'd be like, oh, okay, there we go. I definitely had, my aunt was a trumpet player. She's also, she's kind of one of those Renaissance women type people. So she's a really great athlete, but also a mathematician, and played trumpet really exceptionally well. And so I always used to go with my dad to their Christmas Eve services and sit sort of inside the brass quintet. And I had always sort of done that for years. And I wasn't like the kind of kid that like when I picked up the horn, it was just this like burning desire to be on it all the time. And I was a little bit slow to the uptake on that side of things. But I do remember hearing my Aunt Janet play a lot, even as a little kid. And that sort of, I think, was always kind of in there from hearing a good trumpet sound early on type thing. But it sort of took me a little while. It wasn't until I was about 15 that I realized, like, oh shoot, this is what I want to do. So I'm either gonna figure it out or die trying type thing. But I was definitely not always that way. Like my younger brothers were a little bit more like that earlier, which was weird for me. I was like a 12-year-old kid working at the golf course in the summer, and they were just downstairs practicing tuba and trombone like 8 hours a day. And I was very envious of that work ethic and like love. I was like, man, I don't know why I don't like to practice, or blah blah blah, And so I was always like looking up to my brothers kind of in that way. It eventually kind of kicked in, but I was a little late to the party, I think.
Well, in the long run, I don't think so.
It all kind of comes out in the wash, and
Sure.
for everybody's personality styles and.
So I do want to go back because I have a son who's in Suzuki violin right now.
Oh, nice.
And just maybe to clarify for some listeners that, Suzuki starts off being rote taught for quite a while, but they eventually do get into reading. Mm-hmm. And I'm quite impressed right now that even in the first 10 lessons of reading that he's already reading compound meter.
Oh wow, that's better than I could do.
So
by a lot,
right?
Yeah.
So I want to give the Suzuki method credit. It's not purely a rote taught method, but the other thing I love about Suzuki is it seems to produce some fearless performers. Because you're from the beginning, you're asked to
you gotta just
go
for it
and perform, right?
Yeah, and you gotta just give recitals as like little kids and stuff. And
so you talk about your progression of teachers. It was really from coast to coast for what you did. Were these teachers that you directly sought out, or were these people that your teachers said, okay, I think this is where you need to go next?
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of a mix of both in a way. So the way I wound up in Cleveland, so I was studying with Kevin in New York at the time, and at this point, I still was convinced I was going to just go to college and then move back to New York if I wasn't going to college in New York and just try to be a jazz trumpet player. That was like my sort of goal. Kevin was not like, it's not like he was discouraging me from being a jazz trumpet player, but his point to me as a 16-year-old was like, look, it's great that you're interested in that, maybe more so than classical trumpet, which was totally the case. But, it's a lot easier for you to dip outside of a classical trumpet undergrad and play as much jazz as you want than to do the reverse, just in case you end up wanting to do classical trumpet later. Because, he's not wrong about this. And actually, in hindsight, that was a really huge defining moment for me in a way, because, I decided to go to a classical college and sort of follow his advice, and he was totally right. My first 2 years at CIM, I wouldn't mail it in. I really took my lessons seriously and trumpet class seriously, but the orchestral classical side of things, I just was not into it. So I would just spend all my time playing with this little jazz trio I started and studying with all the people in Cleveland and going to concerts, and I couldn't have cared less about pursuing like an orchestral. But Kevin was right. You do all your classical studies, and it's easier to go outside than it is to just study jazz all day and then go try to play in a Mozart pickup orchestra or something, because it just doesn't, just the way the environment works, it's easier to just hop into a jam session than it is to just hop into a classical revolution, or you know what I'm saying. Yeah, it's like
I do, but one of the things when I have students come to me and say, I want to study this or that or the other, and I say, look, it's all about style.
Yeah.
When it comes down to the basic part of it, we all blow through the little end, the sound comes out the big end. And whether you're a jazz player or a classical player, the fundamentals are still the same. So, it isn't really, as long as you can get the efficiency down, the tone production, then the musicality is whether you decide to swing it or play it straight, or it's whether it's Brahms or Basie.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely when push comes to shove, that's sort of how it comes out in the wash, But I think it's kind of the thing where I was like kind of just going through I eventually started to take a turn, obviously, to go a way different direction. But it was about, I guess, towards the end of my time at Cleveland that I started realizing I actually want to do at least sort of more of a 50-50 type lifestyle where I'm playing both, But getting to Cleveland in the first place, anyway, I got way diverted. But Kevin was like, Cleveland Orchestra's in town at Carnegie. Get your brothers, go to the show. You got to hear this. I had never heard them before, so we got this absolute nosebleed seat. First half was Mozart, which, as much as the second half, blew me away. I never heard a string section like this, and especially in Carnegie, it was just unreal. And then the second half was Bruckner 5, which I never heard in my whole life. And so it starts off with this soft cello, boom, boom, thing, and then this brass chorale, and again, never heard anything quite like this. It's a very different style playing than the New York Philharmonic, and it was just something about this orchestra. It was literally in that moment I was like, if I can figure out a way to get into this school, I
And sax is in the lead seat.
Yeah, sax, Sullivan, everybody was in the section at the time, and I was like, I gotta hear this I gotta be as close to this orchestra as I possibly can, which was kind of an interesting thing for me to feel at the time, especially because I was still so thinking I was gonna just only really become a jazz trumpet player. And so that's how I wound up in Cleveland, of all things. And that was sort of the one of the few times where a teacher was like, check this out. And he wasn't like, you have to go study with X, Y, and Z, but Kevin was just encouraging me to at least. And then similar thing, when I was in Cleveland, I was figuring out what I wanted to do after, and Los Angeles seemed like a good city if you wanted to try to play in a lot of different styles. And both my teachers, Mike Miller and Mike Sachs, were very supportive of this. And it was sort of, because of Colburn's sort of financial package, but also specifically I had some friends that had studied with Jim before, and so I really wanted to study with him specifically. And that was kind of from my teacher's side of things, it was like, yeah, of course, go study. That's a no-brainer. It's great, blah, 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 great school, everything, and he's awesome. But I was like, something about the way this guy plays, I was really drawn to this, and I was like, I really would love to study with him if I could swing it, kind of thing,
So I remember hearing Kevin with American Brass Quintet.
Oh, yeah.
And then I bought, I think the album was called One.
Oh yeah, where he does all the
Company.
solo trumpet stuff. Yeah.
What an absolutely gorgeous sound. And it reminded me of Phil Smith. The very first recording I ever heard of Phil Smith was The Unanswered Question.
Oh yeah.
You know,
That's
just
a
one
good
of the
disc.
most pure sounds you can ever hear come from a trumpet. So when I hear you say that Kevin's telling you to go study somebody else, it's like, okay, so now you get an idea of who he epitomizes
Right.
as a player and what kind of sounds.
Yeah.
It's just kind of interesting thread to follow to see who really listens to and enjoys the other.
Yeah, totally. It is wild to kind of backtrack and see and actually funny along those lines, Jim and Mike Miller both studied with the same teacher, Eugene Blee, in Cincinnati as each other, which is a wild thing because those are both guys that I study with totally nowhere near Cincinnati. You know, it's like similar type thing where it's just like, wow, what's the chances, you know? So it's kind of a wild thing.
So how long since you've had some serious in-school study?
I guess when did I finish up? I guess spring of 2013. I guess I graduated from Colburn and then moved to Tucson. So yeah, what year is it now? Well, whatever. It's been a little while.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
So now, I'm not trying to get you to divulge anything you don't want to.
Oh no, I'm pretty open about it.
I tell my students I'm always seeking to learn something new. I'm taking lessons with whoever I can, whenever I can. What's your situation? Are you looking still to go study with somebody?
I mean, yeah. Whenever I can squeeze it in. I mean, there's been a handful of people that I as much as I can, I always kind of check back in with both mics in Cleveland at different times in the year, just do some playing together. Usually with that type of thing, a lot of it will be just like kind of blowing through some stuff together or things like this. But I've had some specific things that I've wanted to work on with different people over the last handful of years that I've sought them out in different cities or things like that. And I've seen Jim a handful of times, you know, especially if I was getting ready for auditions, I would go from Tucson to see him before Indianapolis or San Francisco, whatever. And always play for him before an audition. I guess I'm trying to think most recently what I've got cooking. There's a friend of mine who's a former teacher of mine, Joe Bergstaller, who I absolutely love,
fantastic.
but I kind of made a trip to go see him to work on some stuff that I've been kind of circling in the last year or so. You know, so I'm very much kind of always going that way. I mean, you definitely, compared to being in school versus out of school, I mean, you're way on your own, even if you're taking one lesson a month compared to the way school feels, you know. But, you know, Jim and Mike Miller both were very kind of, not hands-off teachers, but I was sort of always a little bit in charge of, like, monitoring my own, I guess, assignments or whatever you call it. But I guess I was pretty comfortable always with sort of taking care of myself in that way, which I think really helped me, because when I got out of school and didn't have a teacher all the time, I didn't flail and be like, oh, God, what do I do now? But I'm still always looking to study, and, you know, I mean, I'm like a avid, I guess if I had any hobbies besides like eating and drinking, it's like watching YouTube master classes or things like this. I'm way into that kind of stuff. So
okay, you know, people think orchestral trumpet, it's kind of this one large lump of an idea of playing, but you went from Tucson to San Francisco, from what most people would consider their typical orchestral atmosphere to not, right? Because ballet or opera is a completely different animal.
That was wild.
And, you know, so what kind of a learning curve was there to acclimate to the pit?
There was definitely one, for sure. I mean, Tucson was kind of a really cool first job in so many ways, but playing first trumpet there on a lot of big rep, and then also having the downtime to travel to sub in other places, I was getting a cool mix of playing first trumpet, but then also having to play third or second or other things when I would go sub places and stuff. And so I kind of always had some section playing kind of floating around, but the gig in San Francisco was playing second trumpet. And so not only are you playing second trumpet sort of full-time all of a sudden, but you're in this pit environment, which is like, couldn't be more different. And so I kind of, similar to what we were talking about before, I sort of just did my best to just kind of lead with my ear as far as just like, all right, be on the constant alert to just adapt to style or how this feels versus close sound versus far sound, because all of a sudden, you know, the acoustics are different up close versus how it sounds in the hall. I mean, luckily, that was kind of an easy place to plug into just because the principal trumpet there, Adam Luffman, he's actually also a former Cleveland guy, but comes from a similar tradition that I do, and he's so solid and really such a fabulous player that it's like those kind of people are easy to lock with, you know, and same thing goes for sort of the whole brass section there. So on the one hand, there was definitely a lot of adjustments I made, I felt like, you know, internally, but the overall of it was like, oh man, these guys are great musicians, just plug in the best I can as far as just a musical standpoint, and it sort of takes care of itself. So there was sort of a yes and no side to just like a learning curve, because on the other hand, it was just like, oh man, this is great, just playing 32 Nutcrackers is a lot, but if you have to do it, that's like the best crew you could do it with, kind of a thing. So, which I didn't realize at the time, but that was totally getting me ready for Yuletide, and here doing however many shows we do. It's a mentally similar type thing.
So, just want to think back. Have you gotten to play Bruckner 5 yet?
You know, Bruckner 5 is one of the Bruckners that I still have yet to play, and it's ironically, it's I think it's probably one of my favorites in part because of that first experience, but it's really one of my favorite symphonies of just any symphony, any composer. And I do like Bruckner's music overall. However, I really love 5, and I've only gotten to play 4, 7, and 9, so I got a few more to go, obviously, outside of 5. But yeah, 5, I'm looking forward to the day that kind of rolls onto the stand. So
very cool.
Yeah, we'll see. Not a lot of people do it, but.
So let me ask you, Conrad, now, as far as your teaching, what opportunities do you have to influence other people?
Yeah, well, since moving to Indy, I've kind of had a very small, just private trumpet studio of sort of young college and high school-ish age, I would say. Not a ton of students, not because I don't like to teach, but just because with playing schedule and stuff, there's only sort of so many hours I could devote to that in a week. But so outside of that, I've done just some, master classes here and there at some various schools that friends of mine are the trumpet professors at or something. And this coming year, I'm actually going to be filling in, teaching at DePauw University, just I think for a semester or maybe a little bit longer than that. And I've, taught for Rommel a little bit here and there when he goes out of town at IU. And so not a ton of teaching, but it's something that I really enjoy. So whenever I can stuff it into the schedule, I try to.
Have you found any of your previous teachers coming through
totally.
in your lessons? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, and I can kind of almost feel who's coming through and when, depending on what kind of stuff I'm working on. I mean, if somebody wants to come to play excerpts or something for me, or if they're getting ready for an audition, I tend to go into pretty hardcore Jim Wilt mode, which is like a lot of playing and sort of helping them start to hear things a little bit differently that might influence the way they practice or stuff like that. But if somebody wants to work on something else, or if it's a younger student that's sort of building their foundation still, I find I dip a little bit more into the older school Cleveland style of things, where I'm trying to really impart just a good basic approach to them. I don't really feel like I subscribe to a school of playing. I mean, I use Cleveland as if it is one, but you sort of know what I mean. It's like I don't really have like a particular method, but I do believe in certain types of fundamentals pretty strongly, and so I try to just tailor my approach depending on what it sounds like somebody needs.
That's from a teaching standpoint. So let's talk about fundamentals on a daily basis for you.
Yeah. So I've kind of, I guess my fundamental routine sort of has been kind of similar actually for a handful of years now, and I have about 4 or 5 routines that cycle themselves through depending on what I feel I need or what the schedule sort of demands of me on a weekly basis. There's 2 things that pretty much I always do at least once a week. One of those is sort of a fat Arbenz routine that usually happens on Mondays. That's kind of like my sort of rebuild the foundation day, because we're off from the orchestra and usually I have enough chops to spend a little extra time on that kind of playing on Monday. And then I have a routine that I made from the David Zauder book that also finds its way into my weekly stuff at least once or twice. And then there's about 3 or 4 other things that I've developed over the years that sort of float in and out depending on what I feel I need. A lot of it, there's a routine I made from the Flexus book that John McNeil and Laurie Frink put together that's sort of a shorter one that if I really need to jumpstart things in the upper register or flexibility, I kind of hit that. I have some other kind of, I guess you could call it more flow type things. I don't tend to practice a lot of that stuff anyway, so sometimes I need to insert these stamp style things into the routine. But yeah, I would say mostly it's been a not slow moving, but slowly evolving thing. I'm kind of careful to add new stuff in. I really want to make sure it has a purpose and helps me get to where I want to go as far as whatever trumpet playing goals I have. But it's mostly Arbenz based, really, at the end of the day, I would say. Nothing too fancy.
Cool.
That type of thing.
Right.
I mean, I think you got the gist of it. But yeah, I mean, my basic thing with fundamentals is like, I think we all tend to build our routines or our foundation of playing based on what we grow up with at the time that we're really forming. I mean, what you do in college, I think it really sets the base for the rest of your career in some ways. But ultimately, I think it's just about finding, what your body needs, what your embouchure, what your style of playing is, and then you figure out stuff that's going to really fortify it, and then also give you a platform to make improvements. I mean, everybody is way different, and I am sort of half a creature of habit / half a creature of likes to change things up. I mean, some people can't stand to do the same thing every day. For me, there's a certain, context that you set up by doing at least certain things enough so that you develop a baseline of consistency, and then when you want to make a change, you have a platform to stand on to sort of make an adjustment. So, I mean, I have tons of things that I'm constantly working on, and this same Arben routine that I've been doing since 2009, in a lot of ways, although people might think that could become mundane to do the same 45 an hour set of exercises. I mean, I change up articulations and dynamics, things like that, but, what your focus is on can really drastically change the way that routine is going to feel, and then at least you have a physical basis to build off of. So for me, that's been something that's been helpful, and that's, I think, why I have it sort of pinned down to about 5 or 6 things. And I'm always interested to see what could I add that might kind of juice the system. But it's been helpful to me to just be like, okay, today or for the next 3 weeks, my focus is to really get sort of my immediacy, or how fast the sound is happening at the front of the notes. That's the focus, and it's like the Arben routine is a perfect way to work on that, because you're literally just playing scales and fanfares and slow long tones for an hour, and it's simple enough that you can focus on these very basic skills that you want to get better at, instead of having to worry about doing it while you're doing pyrotechnics or whatever other stuff. So, that's kind of how I wound up doing this. But I think it's important to understand that everybody has to be different, and it's a little bit, just because our trumpet is so physical that everybody's jaw, everybody's face is just different. And it took me a little bit to start to get to a place where I was comfortable being like, what's working for me doesn't seem to be the stereotypical standard, or what mouthpiece I play is not the whatever it would be. But it's important to feel comfortable to be like, I got to do what works for me, and just sort of roll with that as best you can. It doesn't mean to shut off to outside things, but there's a certain point where it can be unhelpful to just be like, well, this worked for this person, so I got to just keep cranking it out mindlessly, and it's only so long. Yeah.
If you were to take all of your routines, you said 5 roughly,
yeah,
and even in different stages of evolution for each of these routines, and line them up side by side, would you see some elements of each one of those that were consistent from day to day to day?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely, I would say that my approach, as far as just like what I'm going for in the sound, feel, those types of things, I would say is consistent enough that, in a weird way, even though, let's just say if Arbenz is on the far side of the spectrum of the routines, and then let's say Flexus is on the opposite one, whatever approach that I'm bringing with the instrument and from a sound concept standpoint, and what I'm trying to get out of the bell is consistent enough that it doesn't feel as far across the spectrum as it might seem on paper, and so I think you could approach Flexus from the standpoint of the way they wrote the book, which is really flexibility for an improviser, so that you have in your chops the ability to kind of just do whatever your mind wants on a split second notice, and at the same time I sort of took the book actually John McNeil gave it to me when I was taking lessons with him as a knucklehead 19-year-old jazz trumpet player over the summer, and I actually didn't use it for many years until this LA studio guy sort of mentioned something about it, and I was like, oh, I think I have one of those. And I just made this sort of orchestrally approached 30-minute routine out of Flexus, where I'm approaching the book differently than John even had me go through it with him many years before. But then you can sort of introduce new things, but still kind of keeping that thread like you were talking about. There's like a consistent type of thing that pulls it all together. So I think kind of how you approach it can maybe accomplish that, but that's hard to know. But,
well, even if you don't have Clark 1 or Clark 2 in every routine, I would say you're always focused on your sound. That's probably got to be a given.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, all the issues that I'm working on a daily basis, so many of them, my sound or how I sound on a certain thing is my indicator of what's working or what's not. For me, I feel like it gets a little dangerous if I get too analytical about what's actually really going on here. Sometimes it can be helpful, and I got plenty of problems, so it's kind of like I try to find a balance between making actual physical adjustments, I mean, whether it's to my posture or whatever else, but still trying to always lead with like, okay, if it sounds healthy and sounds like what I'm going for, chances are the physical stuff will take care of itself to a point, So I think you're totally right. That's definitely my number one focus, on a daily basis.
So let's talk about people that you enjoy listening to. Maybe you epitomize. I'll start by just saying Sergei. That's for me.
Yeah.
That's just exquisite playing. It's the model of efficiency.
Oh,
but
man.
what about for you?
Oh, I still remember the first time I heard his No Limits record where he plays the Saint-Saëns introduction in Rondo, and that sort of just ruined my life for about a year. Just listen. I mean, in an amazing way, of course. Well, I mean, it's kind of sort of floated in and out over the years. But when I was younger, the big influences from how should I phrase it? I mean, the first people that I really listened to that I actually was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually captivated by this, because I really was not enjoying classical music all that much for a while. But Ralph Smedvig and Empire Brass, absolutely for sure, has been my earliest influence and the most constant of anything. I mean, that's still, listening to Empire and Ralph specifically, that's been maybe the most consistent thing throughout my life as far as just what I'm listening to on a weekly basis. I mean, I don't think a week goes by that I don't spend at least an hour and a half listening to Empire something.
I may have to edit this out because I'm not sure how to describe it, but I remember the first time I heard Rolf play, and I didn't know who he was. I just knew it was Empire Brass.
Yeah.
But moving from note to note across the horn was not like anything I'd ever heard before. There was, and I know he wasn't articulating, but there was just this element of his playing. First of all, the sound was gorgeous.
Yeah.
But it was just, everything slotted so beautifully. I mean, maybe he was articulating on some of those things, but do you know what I'm...
Yeah, I mean, he has a real interesting way of kind of... Yeah, he moves through the instrument, I think, different than most people. There's something really, really special there, and it's, his overall product, like all the great articulation, great sound, his insane lyricism that was like sort of, like you said, super slotted, but also didn't feel like a trumpet. And I hate to use that type of cliche, but that all packaged itself with this unbelievable flair and vibe. And I think what you were left with was sort of this real, really astounding player, and so that definitely is the thing that rises to the top for me, maybe over anything else, really, just when I have to look back through the last 29 years, But I mean, in high school, I spent a lot of time listening to the American Brass Quintet as well, and Tom Stevens. Kevin Cobb turned me on to listening to Tom Stevens' recordings, and that transitioned well into sort of moving to Cleveland, and because Mike Sachs, one of his big influences was Tom Stevens, and so there was a real kind of link there from like a sound concept standpoint. And I also spent a lot of time listening to Phil Collins' recordings from his time in Cincinnati and Jim Thompson during the time he was in Montreal especially. And so all those things sort of swirled together. And then when I met Jim and started hearing his sound up close, I think that was sort of the final keg in the wheel or spoke in the, whatever, that sort of kind of pulled it together for me. And all those things, I think, swirled into just whatever I squirted out as. But those are the people that come to mind from at least classical side of things, jazz side of stuff. Clifford Brown is probably the most similar, he's like the Rolf of jazz for me as far as the most constant influence. And, that also kind of dovetailed with some of my more modern trumpet influences. A trumpet player from Cleveland, Dominic Farinacci, is one of my favorites and somebody I got to know a little bit while I was living there and heard live play a ton. And he has a really strong Clifford influence also, and it's, I think, no accident that when I'm like hacking around, there's some of that floating around in there somewhere. I don't know, but
so do you still get an opportunity to feed the creative side on the jazz trumpet?
Yeah, every now and then. Weirdly enough, this job here in Indianapolis, I think I actually, more than most orchestral jobs that I've heard of or done in this country, we do so much of that style of music that I've actually played a lot in that way here. And I never really expected that you could have an orchestra job and be this involved with other styles, but this has been really fun in that way because, from a chop standpoint, I don't really have as much chops as I'd like to outside of the gig to just go blow down 3 jazz sets on a Saturday and then wake up and then play Mozart Requiem on Sunday morning without like airballing every note. So I have to kind of manage the physique, and unfortunately that's the only limitation. I would love to be playing more of other styles, but there's only so much that you can do on a trumpet before you have to start protecting certain types of elements of playing.
Well, it's a responsibility of your main job. You've
right.
got to keep your focus.
I'm sure, I don't know, maybe not, but if I played flute, maybe I could go play like a salsa gig on Sunday night after a matinee for fun and then wake up Monday and still feel okay. But if you do that on a trumpet, it's going to take you until Wednesday to get your low G back. You know what I mean? So it's like a little bit of a, So, but yes, it feels fed, I guess, to a point.
So that makes me ask or lean towards the question of this move by your maestro to start including natural trumpets and natural horns into the orchestra.
Yeah.
And did you have any background or experience there before the request?
I did, luckily, just because it made the, I think, attempt at using these instruments a little smoother than it would have been. But actually, when I was in school in Cleveland, Carl Albach, who's principal trumpet in Orpheus and St. Luke's and fabulous New York freelancer, he was in town subbing with the Cleveland Orchestra and did a trumpet class, and kind of, I don't think he knew any, I don't know if he thought people would take him seriously. I don't know if anybody did, maybe except for me, but he made this comment kind of off the cuff, like, yeah, and if you get a chance to study Baroque trumpet, you really should. And for some reason, me and my little, knucklehead, eager beaver student, I was like, oh, okay, all right, I'll do that. And so I, luckily had no idea before this, but Barry Bogus, who's one of the premier,
right.
Baroque soloists in America, happened to teach at Case Western University, which is the school sort of attached to Cleveland Institute of Music. And they owned all these horns, and there was a whole Baroque orchestra there, so I just asked Barry if I could take some lessons, and so I played in Baroque orchestra for 3 years there.
It was a perfect storm right there.
It was wild, and so I hadn't touched a Baroque trumpet since I left Cleveland, but when this sort of request kind of came down from the music director, it was sort of like, well, this will be a challenge for a variety of reasons, just because we're, stuffing this into a season, so there's other things to consider there as far as what we're playing the week before and after. There's a whole myriad of things that we've had to juggle, but having at least played this instrument for a period of time at some point definitely did come in handy. And if you would have told me, 10 years ago that someday I'm going to have a job playing in an American orchestra where I'm supposed to be playing Baroque trumpet and improvising on a frequent basis, I would have thought, oh, that's not really a thing. That's not possible. And maybe I would have worked on my excerpts and practiced classical music a little harder earlier if I knew that this could be a thing, because this sort of, in a weird way, is like kind of like a dream job for me from a musical standpoint, just because I really am getting to do a variety of things much more than I had in any other orchestral kind of,
It's certainly not a
gig.
C trumpet only kind of job.
Definitely not. Definitely not. And someday I might just go full London Symphony and start playing everything on B flat. But that's down the road, and I think Bob would kill me if he heard this interview, me saying that. But anyway,
I'll make sure I leave that in then. Okay, so I won't name specific names, but I will say that I know you have a great supporting role, or supporting cast.
Oh, totally.
And you know that because you mentioned you were a second trumpet player in San Francisco, and you understand the importance and the difficulty of being a second trumpet player. So even though your role now is as principal, you have that appreciation. You know what they want to hear, and you know what you want to hear. And I think you guys worked that out pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is really important to me. Like as a first trumpet player, I think that I think the givens are, you're responsible for dictating the nuts and bolts, style, articulation, releases, dynamics, the threshold of dynamics, both loud and soft. There's all that kind of stuff, but I think that's sort of the given of what you need to do in that role. But the things that always were most important to me when I used to play first trumpet in Tucson, and then I have a job playing first trumpet in a summer festival orchestra that I do every year, and then also here is I think you're really responsible for setting the tone of I guess just setting the vibe of the way people interact, how does it feel on stage, and playing not first trumpet in a variety of places and getting to play second trumpet to a lot of really great first players. Something that always I noticed was like, wow, okay, of course they're doing a great job of making it easy for me to just play the instrument and know where to put stuff, but really they're shaping the way it feels as a brass section and the way people interact. And how do you get things done? Do you have to yap at everybody, or can there be a sort of more musically directed way that you shape stuff? And that was always the kind of thing that for me I think was most important, to try to figure out a way to do a good job at playing first, more than even just the playing the solos or playing high notes or playing the leading the charge from a style standpoint or whatever else. I mean, that stuff kind of comes with it, but anyway, so I guess that sort of goes to your point. I think I really know how it feels to a certain extent to just be in the different roles in the section, so I want to make everybody feel comfortable, and also I want to be very clear with my body language or playing style, so that there doesn't need to be a lot of unnecessary extra stuff, really, so that we can just have a good time and kind of go for it.
Are you having a good time?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, any day that I'm above ground and playing trumpet is a pretty good day. But it's kind of like you were saying much earlier. But there's a lot of great people, and I think at the end of the day, if you're working with people who are really sweet and have a good attitude, that's pretty much more important than almost anything else. Because who wants to make great music when you're miserable because everybody hates each other? I don't know. Maybe some people thrive off that, but I definitely am not one of them. I mean, it's hard enough to just play high and loud notes all the time, but you don't need extra baggage on top of it. So
I think Indianapolis is unique, not just the symphony, but I think Indianapolis is unique in the music scene, and I don't know anything really outside of the jazz and the orchestral. The music scene here is really diverse.
Yeah.
But there's not that cutthroat atmosphere here. And I've had other friends who've come from the East Coast that are like, man, this is really strange here. Everybody's nice. Everybody treats each other, respectfully. And of course, we all know there's that guy that's out there that kind of breaks that. But I think it's really cool to be here.
Oh, yeah.
Great place to be. A lot of people underestimate Indianapolis.
Oh man, totally.
In a lot of ways, we're not just the Colts. We're not just cornfields.
Yeah, no, it's like the town of silent killers. I mean, even one of our sort of first call guy that has been, both in the section for many 1 years, but also is sort of kind of an honorary member really at this point from playing. But Alan Miller is a great example of like the sort of silent but deadly type of person who's like super warm, really solid, professional as a person, and then just absolutely will tear your face off with the quality of his playing, really in any style. And it's like that was sort of that type of a vibe is sort of something that I always look up to just be like, man, that's the kind of thing that you want to epitomize, you
Yeah.
know, if you can help it, you know. So it's been lucky to be around people like that, obviously within the section and then around town, you know.
Well, I've been fortunate to be able to observe a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The age gap makes no difference in your section because you're replacing somebody who's been there for, I think I did the math. He was in the principal chair for 39 years.
Yep.
And just retired after 41 years.
Mm-hmm.
And which makes him a lot older than you. But seeing you guys interact and that changing in the guard seemed to be just a pretty cool thing to observe, and the amount of respect both ways I think is commendable, because I don't think you'd see that everywhere.
Yeah, no, and that's much more of a testament to Bob and Chappie's personality and character more than anything that I've been involved with, because I mean, yeah, to come in as a 26 or however old I was, you know, year-old principal trumpet, I mean, the ball's in my court to a certain extent as far as how I'm going to operate, but really it's like the way they treated me, I think, really sets the dynamic. And then if I'm not an idiot, you know, I figure it out real quick that these are great guys that are treating me really well, you know, and especially, and so I obviously picked up on that immediately and was really excited to be able to be a part of that, because that's not always the case where a principal trumpet retires after many years, plays assistant, and doesn't vibe the new person, you know. I mean, I felt really lucky to be in that type of an energy, you know. I mean, because kind of, I guess I already said it once, but it's like, it's a hard enough job to just do. Last thing you need is bad vibes floating around. So I think it really just speaks to their quality as people, the way that they've treated me since I've gotten here. So I'm really grateful for that, you know.
Well, Conrad, I think anybody that will listen to this podcast will certainly sense the good vibes coming from you.
Yeah.
And I hope that if they haven't had a chance to hear you live, I hope they get an opportunity, whether it's at Hilbert Circle Theater with the ISO or in some sort of jazz setting.
Yeah.
We'll get a chance to hear you and to meet you. And I just want to thank you for sharing all of this today. It's been a delight to talk with you. And,
well, yeah, thanks for having me. This is
absolutely.
awesome. So happy
Wish
to
you
be,
the best.
yeah, thanks. Happy to be a part of it.
All right. Thank you.
So awesome.